Hey there, I'm Lee Ullman here with some big news from the National Young Farmers Coalition. We're partnering with Heritage Radio Network on a special season of The Farm Report. It's all about what's happening with the Farm Bill and how it impacts farmers and eaters.
I am growing diversified vegetables on land that's been in our family for 150 years.
And so with the pandemic, gentrification, property values going up, we had to sell the land and we lost it.
Join us as we uncover the untold stories behind this massive piece of legislation that shapes how we grow our food, what we eat, and so much more.
The problems we have had, those are things that come from earlier Farm Bill and USDA policy, right? Like Earl Butts, get big or get out.
You know, it's my responsibility to know not only what I'm eating, but then like how that all came to be. And realize like, wow, like this piece of legislation, all this money, like it's technically something that I support as a taxpayer.
While Congress debates the next Farm Bill, this is not just an invitation to listen. It's a call to action. Be part of the conversation. Subscribe to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Enjoy food the way nature intended. Alaska Seafood, wild, natural, and sustainable. For more information, visit wildalaskaseafood.com.
I'm HRN's Executive Director, Katie Mosman-Wadler, jumping in to tell you about this week's episode of Meat and Three, Heritage Radio Network's weekly food roundup. This week, we're introducing you to some amazing women taking a stand.
So often, being sexually harassed feels like a loss of control. And so I wanted to have these very tangible guides to say, here's what you can do.
Others are pushing for more diversity at major food industry events.
I still feel really determined to do, whatever I can to help shift that and in a direction that's not just more diverse, but more equitable.
We also have a report on that summer business staple, the lemonade stand.
The lemonade stand might be the purest form of starting a business. Low overhead, easy to get into, and requires little experience or special equipment.
Don't miss Meat and Three, your weekly 15-minute food news roundup from HRN. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app. Search MEAT+THREE, and thanks, as always, for listening.
Hello, and welcome to A Hungry Society. This is the show where we talk about food, food media, and so much more. Today's guest is Tia Keenan, a cook, writer, and cheese specialist who spent a decade working in New York City restaurants. She is the author of The Art of the Cheese Plate, Pairings, Recipes, Style, Attitude, which came out in 2016, and recently her Chevre Short Stack Edition cookbook was published featuring recipes and stories about Chevre cheese. She is currently working on another cookbook titled Hot Cheese, which will be released in the fall. She lives in Queens with her 2 children and husband. Tia.
Hi.
Welcome to Hungry Society.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here.
So, you are known as, among many things, a cheese expert.
I am the cheese lady, for sure.
And you recently published, or with Short Stack Cookbooks, you published the Chevre edition. It's so much fun.
Thank you. It was their it's the 33rd volume of the Short Stacks, of the Short Stack, and it's their first one about cheese, if you can believe that.
I can't believe that, to be honest.
I know. It took them 33 other foods to get to cheese, which is not... It doesn't usually take people 33 foods to get to cheese.
Right. Cheese is usually front and center.
Like the second or third at least.
Right. And you picked Chevre in particular, and you have this great intro about why you picked Chevre, and I'm going to read this part. And it's talking about how you kind of came to know Chevre cheese. But Chevre was an altogether different thing. It was French, it was fresh, and it was as frisky as the goats whose milk made it possible. Chevre was alive. It was tangy, grassy, citrusy, and bright, and I was smitten at the first bite.
It was really one of my earliest I grew up working class, poor and then working class, in my grandparents' home. And we didn't, we didn't eat fancy cheese. So I remember distinctly like the first time I even had good butter. And it really blew my mind. But so when I was in college, working and the master of my own groceries, that was the first time that I ever tried goat cheese. And I thought I was so fancy, so sophisticated. I also remember buying during that time like arugula for the first time and feeling like I was, just on the cutting edge of fabulousness. And eating that like on a pita bread and just thinking that I was like so fancy.
The book is just, it's so much fun to read. Like it gives like a glimpse into you and what you love about cheese so much. And you also refer to yourself many times as like very similar to the goats that make cheese.
Yeah.
So like as I was digging into like your writing and, press about your last book, like you talk about cheese in this way that's not like, I feel like when people write about cheese, it's like, oh, and the milk is extracted from the cows, and it's like this romantic thing, and you make it like the super fun, like visceral thing to be enjoyed.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad that you feel that way. I definitely, of the three main milking animals, cow, sheep, and goat, goats are, I think we share a lot of personality traits, but also in the book I talk about goats sort of embodying this American attitude of, that irreverent, or at least the attitude that I identify with in food, which is this like irreverence and humor and joie de vivre and just kind of frisky, fun thing. Cows to me are sort of represent like the, like the almost kind of like the corporatist work cow aspect of food, whereas goats are the little like rebel. And so I've just always loved them. And people love goats. I mean, there's like, you could probably type in goat in your GIFs or GIFs, whichever one it is. And, there's dozens of little goat things. People think they're hilarious.
YouTube videos of
goats. I mean, they're just fun. They're fun to watch.
And they're fun to watch get scared.
They've
ever seen that.
They're great. Yeah. They're they're rebellious. There's just something very charming about them.
So, speaking of your past writing, I came across this article about the morning cheese plate and how you like sex, cheese should be had in the morning.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about that on air.
Well, I just want to give a shout out to one of the greats in the business, Kat Kinsman, who let me write that piece. Thank you, Kat. Kat also wrote the intro to my book, which is coming out in the fall, which the title has changed. It's now Melt, Stretch, Sizzle, Not Hot Cheese. I wrote that piece for Kat and Extra Crispy. She's always so great about letting her writers just go for it. And in the piece, I talk about how in Europe, often breakfast is about cheese and meat and how we really don't eat. We eat like melted cheese on things in this country, but there really isn't this tradition of just like a beautiful plate of cheese for breakfast. And it's also true that I like sex in the morning. So I just thought it was a good, like, I like sex and I like cheese in the morning when the day is, when I'm still feeling like optimistic and open to the day.
No, I had never thought about like having cheese in the morning. But it was so true when I was reading it. Like cold breakfast foods, we tend to, have a donut or a granola bar. And how sad is that when you can have some cheese?
Yeah, and we have it all wrong because we like load up on carbs and sugar in the morning when really we need protein in the morning.
So another thing that you have done, and I mentioned it in the intro, is that you worked for a decade in the restaurant world.
I did.
Yeah, and you've
Over a decade, yeah.
Over a decade, yeah. So can you talk a little bit about like kind of that transition from restaurant work to what you do now?
Yeah, I mean, I put myself through college and I got a journalism degree and I came to New York and I tried working in publishing and you know, like I said, I was a working class kid. I was basically self-supporting since I was 18. And all my peers in publishing were basically like trust fund kids or kids whose parents were paying their rent and whatever. And that wasn't my case. And I was starving. I mean, I couldn't afford to live here and work in publishing. And also I was kind of bored by it. I just felt like it wasn't interesting. Like I worked, because I went to like a mediocre state school, not an Ivy League school, like a lot of people in publishing. I had to do 2 internships just to like prove that I was worthy to get like the lowest level job you could get. So I did an internship at Ms. Magazine, and then I did an internship at The Nation. And then I was like fact checking and all of that, and it just wasn't working out. So I started working in restaurants, and I rose pretty quick. Like I started as a waiter, a server, and I rose pretty quickly because I took it really seriously. I didn't, at that time in New York, a lot of waiters were still like actors or, people who wanted to do other things. And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And I started working in restaurants at a time where there was the first wave of like real professionalism, where chefs went from, basically like deadbeats and degenerates to like, this is a serious profession, and we were making chef's gods and sommelier, being a sommelier became a thing. Like who knew, I had no idea that you could sell wine for a living. I was like drinking Boone's wine. So I worked in restaurants and, eventually rose up and I opened up a place and that did really well. And then I was kind of consulting in the restaurant world and in retail and food retail and cheese. And then I had a baby. I had like the thing that you have that's a real, that makes it really, really hard to work in the restaurant business, especially when your partner, if you have one, also works in the restaurant business. And, prior to having a baby, my husband and I were both working 70 hours a week and, spending Sundays eating at every restaurant blowing huge checks and drinking, insane wines and all of that. And then I had a baby and I realized right away, wow, like, I can't just go back to work. Like both of us can't work 70 hours a week. Someone has to actually like parent this child. So I was doing some consulting chef work after I had the baby still. It was really, really hard. I was, like the first consulting chef job I had after having a baby, I think my son was like 4.5 months. And it was at this little restaurant on the Lower East Side. It was a restaurant opening, which was kind of my specialty. I've opened, I don't know, probably 24 restaurants in my career. And I was like, there was one bathroom with no stall, just like one bathroom. And I was like pumping in the bathroom and the kitchen was like 105 degrees and I'm like sweating and I couldn't like drink enough water to be able to lactate properly. This is some real talk from the cheese lady. I was having some hard lactating times. And it was just, and then I was like storing my milk, it was an all male kitchen and I was like storing my breast milk in the walk-in and it was just, ugh. And then I got very lucky, and which was that someone at Rizzoli pitched a book, an editor at Rizzoli pitched a book to Anne Saxelby, who owns Saxelby Cheesemongers and who also had a show on Heritage. And she was like, that's not my book. Like, that's Tia's book. You should call Tia and she should do this book. So they called me and I came in and they had this idea that they wanted a book about cheese plates. And I was like, oh, this is such a specific vision for a book. where did this come from? And they said, oh, have you ever been to this restaurant on 52nd Street? And it was my restaurant.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, that was so, it was kind of this backwards way where an editor had been kind of inspired by my work and then through a roundabout way found me to write this book that like referenced my own work. So then I got super lucky and I wrote that book, and then I thought, oh, like I could, I guess I could write some pieces, and then I got really lucky because I got an assignment from Beth Kracklauer at Wall Street Journal, who's an amazing editor, and then they asked me if I wanted to do a column, and I was so excited because I had for years been saying that I wanted to do a column in a newspaper, and I thought my ambition was that it would be in the New York Times. So I'd been like on a couple of panels on the New York Times, and every time I would go in there, I'd be like, when are you guys gonna, have a cheese column? And then I just was writing more and more, and then the book came out, and it was this little book that no one expected anything to happen to, and it did really well, and it got picked up by Anthropology nationwide, and they sold a ton of these books. And it got all this great press, and I really hustled to promote it because at that point I realized, oh, like this is my chance to really, truly like make a career transition.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think I have a chance to be a writer and to write another book, and so there was a lot of luck involved. There was also I kind of joke that like I put myself through college to get a journalism degree, and then all I had to do was work in restaurants for 15 years to like finally get, finally be able to be a writer. And my sadness only is that, my mother passed away in 2009, and she would always say to me like, oh, the restaurant work is so hard. I know that you love it, but maybe you want to go back to grad school, or, you can't do this forever. And, I feel very sad that she wasn't around long enough to see that I actually was able to somehow like flip this all around and end up ultimately being a writer. She would have been really happy.
Yeah, she would be so proud.
Thank you, Corsha.
So can you talk about like some of the challenges that come with writing cookbooks like this? I mean, like you said, this is like specific, like so specific.
It's so niche-y,
yeah. Like what are the challenges of trying to get a book published like that?
I mean, there's so many. I first feel like I have to acknowledge like the great privilege that I had, which was that I basically like married. Because I got married, I gained a level of financial stability that I never had, and that financial stability enabled me to write that first book, to take that year where I made, like, if I had been living on my own, I wouldn't have been able to be self-supporting. And so, having privilege is a big part of it. And that's a huge part of the problem of publishing. Publishing is also obviously like in crisis and free fall, and everyone's like freaking out. And I think ultimately, like, probably the model of cookbook publishing is ultimately like broken and needs not just some tweaks, but actually like a totally new
like
approach.
An overhaul.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't even know if an overhaul is the right word for it, because I feel like, I've talked with other cookbook authors, successful cookbook authors who also feel the same way. And have been trying to figure out other routes to put their work out into the world. So there's like the general, like, large, big picture of publishing being in crisis and just it not being a livable thing. I think if I were to live off of making cookbooks, like, I'd have to write one a year. I'd have to do a lot of other writing freelance to supplement that. And I also do some like corporate consulting and stuff like that. So there's a lot of supplementing, but also just that pace. Like, I just wrote 3 books in 3 years, basically. Wow. And one of them was this short stack, so it's smaller. It's not a full-length cookbook, but it's grueling. And when you're a single subject author like I am, at least so far, and you're just writing about cheese, and then you're also writing magazine and newspaper articles at the same time, like, to be a compelling voice and to be interested in what you're writing about and to be writing about the same thing over and over again, you know, is a huge challenge for me.
It's tough, yeah.
And I think that happens to a lot of writers who just who can get like pigeonholed into certain topics, and then you're expected to just like write about the same thing over and over and over again. And then you're like boring yourself, and then so of course, you know, what are your readers thinking if you're bored?
You're bored writing it, right?
And you know, there's a lot of challenges. Like there's challenges that are, you know, certainly gendered, I felt, about who gets to have, you know, I think one of the takeaways from book publishing for me is like, it's this catch-22 with making books, because books are in many ways a collaborative thing. You have photographers, you have stylists, you have editors, you have the publisher who has their own agenda, you have the marketing department who increasingly has more and more say about what a book looks and feels like and what its content is. And so if you work well within that team, then sometimes as a woman, it's like, oh, you know, you didn't really like do this book. Like your team is part, you know, like it's the team.
Like people have said that to you? Like
people don't say it to me, but I definitely have felt that vibe from people sometimes. Like I think the catch-22 for women is if you're like a really good collaborator, then your like talent and vision is often sort of downplayed in the success of the final project. And if you're like really pushing your vision and like, you know, stalwart about like maintaining your vision, then like you don't work well with others. So, you know, it's just like, I think for me, one of the challenges is, and for all women, I think is like, we don't get to be, I don't want to say the genius, you know, because that's been like written about a lot, like women don't get to be geniuses, but there is like, we don't get to be visionaries, you know, like
Absolutely.
We sort of have to slog through. And if we are a visionary, then you're a bitch and you don't work well with others. And if you manage to push your vision through in a collaborative way, then like it wasn't really
then you don't
your
get
vision.
the credit for it.
Then it's not your vision, you know? So I think you find that in every industry, but I've definitely felt that in publishing a little bit too.
So you also manage to, among all of the things that you do, you are also like very passionate about activism, and you talk about it all the time. And you wrote this great Bon Appetit piece about why self-led restaurant boycotts in the wake of, you know, revelations about chefs and the Me Too movement, why they're ineffective, and why there are other ways that you can support people that want to be supported, including this show, which I appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I'm an organizer. If I organize a small grassroots organization in Central Queens, and that is basically a collective of white people who work to challenge liberal white people to dive into challenging white supremacy in themselves and also white supremacist systems, but in their neighborhood and in their communities. And that work is internal, it's collective, and then it also is about paying reparations and shifting resources to Black and brown people in our communities. It's based in geography. That work has been, you know, life-changing and incredible for me. It's deep and slow. I love it. It's messy and fucked up, and imperfect and challenging all at the same time. So yeah, I mean, I was an organizer in college too. And then when I moved to New York and sort of was in these like progressive, mostly white circles, I was just grossed out, and I sort of dove into work, into making my career again as a working class person, as someone who had to truly support myself in every way. And then also once I had been married very young, support my husband, who was not American. And then after having my son, and taking on a writer's life, which I had much more flexibility, I was able to start back to organizing.
Yeah, and I mean, you use all of your platforms to talk about these issues, not only in your community, but in the news nationwide. How do you keep yourself from the fatigue that comes with that, with just waves and waves of just bad news?
Well, so, my like practice, I don't spend so much time on Trump or any of that, because to me, like my work is dismantling white supremacy in myself and in my communities in support of Black and brown organizers who have been doing that work in this country forever. So that work exists no matter who's president. It exists no matter who's attorney general. It exists no matter what show is or isn't on television. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, like I obviously keep up with the news, but I see like the much longer view. I connect my work to the Rainbow Coalition, to Ann Braden, to the second wave of civil rights, to John Brown, to the deep and long history of radicalism in this country. So when you take that long view, it's like a lot easier to not get caught up in like this is happening,
like shifting
and that's
your
happening.
Gaze away from
just realizing that I'm part of a history of radicalism, and that I'm raising my son to be part of that history, and his children, should he choose to have them, and that this is a life's work, and that it's not just a life's work, it's generations of work, and that I may never see a lot of the things that I would want to see in the world, but I know that through the work I see those things in my own life. I know that I make relationships and community in my own life that are closer to the vision of the revolution that I want to see. Mm-hmm. So I think when you approach your work like that, it's much easier to sort of just be in it and not get caught up in all the distraction of however it's manifesting itself on that particular news cycle.
So, big question for you. What does a non-white supremacist system look like in restaurants?
Ugh.
If restaurants were better, what would it look like?
I mean, it would obviously be a system where white people weren't centered. It's funny because I had a conversation with a restaurateur, a very respected restaurateur, a leader in the industry, and he said, well, Tia, like I have, like my head of diversity is a Black woman, and like my CFO is a Latina woman, and my, and he was sort of naming, the ways that his company has tried to diversify, and the thing is that it's not about just who the stars are. It's about the rank and file and who's holding power and whose needs are valued and whose work is valued. Like, why isn't a dishwasher? I mean, okay, every chef who's listening, you know that your best dishwasher is the center of your restaurant, right? We know that, like, on a practical level, that no restaurant can function without its best dishwash and porter crew.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So why isn't that person as well paid as anyone else in the restaurant?
And do they have clear paths to management?
Right.
Or
and that was something else I
ownership?
talked about with that restaurateur, actually. It was like, why should there be someone who's worked for you who's a dishwasher for 25 years?
Right.
You know,
Yes,
like,
I
because
saw a
we
post
would
like
never,
that too recently, and I
we
was
would
like,
never expect someone to be a floor manager for 25 years. We would never expect a white guy to be a line cook for 25 years. We would never expect him to work pasta for 25 years. So, you know, that I don't know the answer to what that system looks like, but that system definitely centers the people who really make the food world possible, which are the people who grow the food, pick the food, process the food, clean up the food. And frankly, the origin of the great cuisines of this country are also non-white.
right.
So it takes it doesn't take a tweak in the system. It takes a complete dismantling and reimagining and re-envisioning of that system. And, like, frankly, I'm not the one to re-envision and reimagine that system. Like, I would see my role as to be there in support of the people who should really be doing that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have been here nodding to a lot of the things that you're saying. And just quickly, as I was saying, I saw a post that was a porter at a well-known restaurant here in New York. It was a post of, like, the owner of the restaurant being like, thank you so much for working here as a porter for 35 years. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to be like, have you offered this person, like, a clear path to management in the 35 years that they've been there? Yeah. Maybe they want to stay in that role. I don't know. But from working in restaurants, I know that, like, those paths are not often there for women and people of color. Mm-hmm. And it's just, you know, the rock star white guy line cook is expected to move up and move on to whatever they want to do. And the rock star woman or person of color is expected to be promoted and stay within. Yeah. It's never quite like, oh, this is your platform to do whatever you want. It's like, these are the four walls, and here's what you can have within them. Yeah. If you're lucky.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of just things built into the system that weed us all out, you know. So, for instance, like having a baby, you know, or wanting a family, you know, weeded me out for sure. Getting older, you know, let's talk about the ageism. How do you do the brutality of that work forever? Though I will say that some of the lowest paid, least prestigious jobs in the restaurant business are often held by people who do that very physical work well into their 50s and 60s sometimes. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I mean, I think ultimately, like, you know, just to totally blow it out there, like, you know, we need to destroy capitalism, and, like, maybe the restaurant gets destroyed in that process. I don't know. I'd be okay with that, actually.
I mean, I think there are some people who are looking at different ways of doing, like you said, there are people who are actively doing this work every day. Yeah. There's a great organization that your Bon Appetit article, Fast Food Justice. Uh-huh. I love that organization. Yeah. Can you tell listeners about that group real quick?
I'm actually not super knowledgeable about them, so I feel like I don't want to speak. Okay. But certainly, like, you know, to me, the most important, like, first of all, I just want to say I'm so over, you know, like the thought leader, tech, approach to like food conferences and all of it. Like the people who should be at food conferences are like farmers, farm workers, people who work in food service, who work in fast food, because that's the majority of the working people in the food industry. So the organizations that to me are doing the most meaningful work are organizations that are made up of those people, that are made up of fast food workers, that are made up of farm workers, that are, truly grassroots. I feel like, we're sort of confused about like what grassroots means, but grassroots is like coming up from the bottom. That's what grassroots is. It doesn't mean like, it's just someone like in their laptop in a coffee shop, like making a Facebook page is not grassroots. Grassroots is like bottom up work. So to me, those are always the organizations that are doing the most interesting and the most revolutionary work of really challenging the status quo and the systems that create the deep racial and economic inequality that exists in our industry.
Mm-hmm. And Fast Food Justice is an organization here in New York that fought for
the fight for 15.
Yep, the fight for $15 an hour, and they got it. They helped that happen.
Yeah,
here in New York, and they